today. Many Americans and most Ohioans think that most of the wrangling that's been going on in Washington is coming to an end. It is just beginning. Looming over us in the next 2 months is sequestration, which deals with the federal budget, but also deals with high-level impacts on state budgets. The crux of the sequestration, which was worked out at the end of 2011, is that there are automatic spending and across-the-board cuts that will be implemented unless we find other revenue offsets. As you'll hear in this press conference, and we'll have Wendy Patton, Representative Hagan, and then Representative Foley will be here shortly. You will hear about the impacts that all this will have on the state budget and the federal budget, but I do want to bring to your attention, and I'll talk about this a little later, a study that came out today from the Institute for Economic Policy, which has talked about increasingly the pressure on people of lower income who are paying a higher amount of their taxes because of this effort to give corporate tax loopholes and income tax cuts and get rid of progressive taxation. If you're poorer, you spend more of your money on things like food and basic necessities of life. And therefore, you are actually being taxed at a higher level under consumption tax than under the income tax. Now, the reason I bring this up is we are talking about the federal budget and the federal issue of cuts versus raising revenue. But when you couple that with the Kasich administration rhetoric coming up, talking about the future budget, this could be a perfect storm where it will be a very devastating effect on the average Ohioan who is middle class or poorer, having their taxes raised while wealthier Americans and wealthier Ohioans increasingly pay less and less of a proportion of their income for the greater good. It's not fair. It's bad for America, and it creates an economy that is less driven by consumers spending money and more driven by investors hoarding money on Wall Street, which hampers our recovery as a nation. So with that, I'm going to bring up Wendy Patton from Policy Matters, and then Representative Hagan will follow after that, and Representative Foley if he's here, and if not, I will follow up after Representative Hagan.
Thank you, Brian. I'm Wendy Patton, Senior Project Director with Policy Matters Ohio. Policy Matters Ohio is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan research organization with the mission of creating a more prosperous, equitable, and sustainable Ohio. As the next phase of budget debate shapes up again in Washington, the principles that we, Policy Matters Ohio, recommended for the fiscal cliff negotiations remain the same. Policymakers must ensure that deficit reduction does not hurt families and children, deepen poverty, and increase inequality. Significant progress has been made already towards decreasing the deficit. In the last 2 years, Congress enacted legislation that will reduce the deficit by nearly $2.3 trillion over 10 years. Nearly 3/4 of the policy changes came from the spending side, and only 1/4 came from revenues. The spending cuts that have been enacted so far have been almost entirely from discretionary spending. That's the 40% of the federal budget that's controlled on an annual basis by the appropriations process. About half of the discretionary budget funds are grouped together under the heading of non-defense programs. This includes the critical investments in education, in scientific and medical research, in roads, bridges, and ports, veterans programs, environmental protection, public safety, and other critical services. As a result of the Budget Control Act of 2011, non-defense discretionary funding is now scheduled to be at its lowest levels in 50 years by 2017. So cuts in these important investments are inevitable over the next decade. This will have a big impact on Ohio. More than 1/3 of overall total state spending comes from the federal government. Medicaid, which is not a discretionary program, Medicaid is the biggest source of funding to the state. Non-defense discretionary funds are particularly important for our human services, but they also flow through agencies you may not expect, such as the Ohio Department of Agriculture with a 20% share of federal funding. Education, 19% of the Ohio Department of Education funds are federal funds. Development, 34%, and many more agencies. We know that the job of putting the federal budget on a more sustainable path is not yet completed. In his news conference on January 14th, the President said that about $1.5 trillion additional savings is needed to stabilize the debt relative to the economy. Several steps were written into law to hold the Congress and President's feet to the fire to get the job done. The 2011 Budget Control Act has called for another $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction. It created a super committee, bipartisan, to come up with the savings, and the super committee was unable to do that. As a result, this $1.2 trillion in automatic cuts will go into effect over the next 9 years unless Congress replaces them with other deficit reduction measures. The first round of cuts in this current year, just over $85 billion, is scheduled to go into effect March 1st. They will be evenly divided between defense and non-defense spending. Virtually every non-defense discretionary spending program will be cut by 5.1%. If they go into effect, these cuts are going to hit the state and local budgets, going to hit Ohio hard. Representative Mike Foley and Policy Matters Ohio worked together to make sure that we understood the impact of the sequestration. Last March, at the representative's request, the Legislative Services Commission calculated federal funds for Ohio that would be reduced and found that the reduction would be more than $300 million. We found that more than $133 million would be cut from K through 12 education as a result of the sequester. Federal work-study funding that could support 2,000 college students would vanish. Although Congress reduced the sequestration in this first year by $24 billion in the fiscal deal, the impact of cuts on Ohio will still be significant in this year. Additional deficit reduction is needed, but it can't come all from spending cuts. Several bipartisan groups that have studied the deficit, including the President's Deficit Reduction Commission, a bipartisan commission, recommended proposals that would have resulted half in savings from spending and half in savings from revenue increases. If it comes all from the spending side of the equation, as it's currently scheduled to, the ratio of spending cuts to revenues would be 5 to 1. We need to protect important investments that help us educate children, train our workforce, and protect our communities with a basic safety net. To achieve a balanced mix of spending cuts and tax increases, revenues have got to be part of the next round of deficit reduction. The Coalition for Human Needs outlines some of the choices facing Congress. For example, $21 billion over the next 10 years could maintain favorable tax treatment for hedge fund managers, or it could support housing vouchers and the Women, Infant, and Children's Nutrition Program. We could spend $156 million for 2 V-22 Osprey helicopters, which are not as effective as we had originally hoped, or we could provide child care to 22,000 children of families with low incomes. The 2-month rollback of sequestration in the fiscal cliff deal was paid for by an equal mix of spending and revenue. Additional savings should come from closing tax loopholes that benefit big corporations and wealthy people. During his negotiations with the President late last year, Speaker Boehner offered to raise $800 billion in revenues exclusively from tax reform, which he later raised to $1 trillion. Clearly, both sides recognize that savings can come from tax reform. Smart choices now will mean less poverty, a stronger middle class, and a healthier economy in Ohio and all over the nation. Thank you.